Abby Ginzberg, hi. Thanks
Good
for joining us
morning.
today. Good morning. Yeah, we were very sorry that you weren't able to make it to us yesterday, but glad that you made it to your next destination safe and sound. And very grateful for the fact that you're joining us here today.
Yeah,
So we're going to share this with our audience and hopefully a few more people, and kind of try and spread the word of your film and Henrietta Szold, more specifically speaking, to a broader audience.
great.
Um,
Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course, of course. So I'm gonna hop right into it. So in the film, you talk about how you've had this idea for this movie for over 20 years, and that it's kind of got pushed behind other projects over the years. But what was the real impetus and the instigating factor that drove you down onto this path and to tell this story?
I kind of had to have a come to Jesus moment with myself where I really had to say, are you ever going to do this film? I mean, it's one thing to think about something for 20 years when you've got 40 years ahead of you. It's another thing when you've got maybe 10. So I had to ask myself, if you're on your deathbed, having not completed this film or having not really jumped into it, how will you feel? And I decided I would feel bad. So that was literally like what made me dive off the cliff. I just thought, no, I'm not going to be okay if I don't take this project on. And for an independent documentary filmmaker, taking the project on is really making a commitment to spend somewhere between
Hmm.
3 and 5 years of your life making the film because you also have to raise the money. So
Hmm.
I knew before I ever started this was going to be $500,000 plus it had to be raised and a huge amount of archival research and travel to Israel as well as, around the country here. And I was like, okay, better now than later. And I said to myself at the time, it's not going to get easier to do this film when you're 75.
For
So,
sure.
and I was 70. And there's one other piece of this, which is when I was 50, even though I understood sort of a bit about who Henrietta was, she wasn't quite talking to me yet. And there
Hmm.
was something about turning the age that I always thought she was. So, like when she was 50 to me, she looked like she was 70 anyway. So there was something about crossing that line and becoming 70 myself that made me think, Henrietta, I can start hearing you now. And could really appreciate differently, I think, what it meant that she worked so hard during her 60s and 70s to accomplish what she did. I mean, she was no spring chicken when she was doing all the work that's documented in the film. And the fact that she was able to do it almost single-handedly was something that I knew, but I didn't know how she did it or who helped her or you know what kind of the circumstances were. So the dive into the archives was fascinating because you really get to see how much she was managing, if not by herself, along with Hans Beit. It's not only you bring, say, a group of 700 kids to Palestine who have never lived outside of a major city and have to figure out how they're going to function in agricultural settings, but some of them weren't happy. Some of them were complaining. Some of them wanted to move. Some were religious and were non religious, kibbutzim, blah, blah, blah. So it was a mess. And she was literally the person who had to solve all those problems. So you have a lot of respect for a woman who's like, she's not just meeting the boat and then goodbye. She is managing the lives of every single one of them if they need something. And that was remarkable to me as well. And part of why that was true is she had made a commitment to the kids' families that she would look after them. And she really held herself to a very high standard about doing that. So, not only did she never retire, she really wasn't able to retire because it was like it was in her hands. She died. Hans Bate continued the work. And it's actually, we've managed to see the effects even to today. But,
Hmm.
kudos to her for all she was able to do.
100%. I think the film says it really well of that she became a mother to a whole generation of kids that didn't have mothers, and that's a job you can't really ever retire from.
Exactly.
Uh,
And she
yeah.
literally, if somebody wanted to marry somebody from another kibbutz, she had to figure that out. She had to arrange a wedding. She just had to make sure that they were really, I mean, by the time, they might be complaining or talking to her in the mid 40s, the parents were already exterminated.
Hmm.
So many of the people that actually were brought to Palestine ended up, as Michal Auerbach says in the film, what happened to my family? Well, they were all exterminated in Auschwitz or somewhere else. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So she really, I mean, she really did have to look after them.
Yeah, so actually, on the note of family and family connections and stuff, the film obviously shows your family connection to Henrietta. I wanted to ask about that because I think Abed was it at the cemetery.
Yeah. Grave tender.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I think he refers to you as Henrietta's family. So I wanted to ask if there was a connection beyond the Louis Ginsburg connection to
Oh,
your
yeah, there
family.
is. So my mother's maiden name was Zold.
Mhm,
So
okay.
my mother was a Zold. Her father was Henrietta's third cousin. I don't know
Mm,
genealogy well enough to tell you what that means, but it could be like Henrietta's great grandfather and my grandfather's great great were brothers. So
mhm.
somewhere back in, in Hungary, and the name is rare. They're not like a lot of
Yeah.
kids wandering around. So they were related. So my grandfather and Henrietta always knew they were cousins, and they were quite close, as was my Zold grandmother, whose name
Hmm.
was Zip Zold, and who became a national president of Hadassah in the late 20s. So Henrietta was a member of my mother's family, essentially. And when she came back to the United States to visit, she would go visit at their home, which was in Westchester, New York. And so again, I'm related to Henrietta on my mother's side, but distantly. And then there was this story about Henrietta having worked with my grandfather and having fallen in love with my grandfather, who did not reciprocate. And that's a whole other piece of the story. So I am literally related to Henrietta on my mother's side and the granddaughter of the man who broke her heart. I mean, I don't know how to say it any more simply than that, but that's kind of what it is. So I mean, as we all do, we grow up with whatever our last name is, in my case, Ginsburg, but always aware of my mother's maiden name because those are all my Zold relatives. And my mother only had sisters. So the Zold name didn't really pass very well in her family. But she and her sisters all, when asked their names, my mother would say Ruth Zold Ginsburg. I mean, they kept the Zold as a middle name that they
Hmm.
used. So anyway, I grew up knowing I was both a Zold and a Ginsburg, and that's reflected in the film. I mean, a part of why I thought, if I tell this story as somebody that's both related to Henrietta and related to the man who broke her heart, I'm going to tell it a little differently.
Yeah,
Um,
it definitely seems that you were the right person to be telling the story. I don't know how many other people are out there walking around today with as many real, tangible connections like you have.
right.
And
I,
that,
I
and
think,
that
I mean, I was certainly the only filmmaker who was going to, with that.
for sure,
Yeah.
for sure, for sure. And that actually leads me right into my next question. So, in your radio interview that you had done, you discussed how not a lot of people know about who Henrietta was, and people talk about, oh, you're making a film about the street Henrietta Szold. And so I wanted to ask, having grown up with this connection, what were the stories of Henrietta like in your house while you were growing up? Like, did your grandfather talk to you about her at all? Did your mom talk to you about her at all? What was that like?
Well, okay. So it was complicated for my mother because, and this is a question it's not in the film, and I only bring it up when somebody asks directly. What was complicated for my mother about Henrietta and the whole Hadassah thing is this. When my grandmother in 1928 became national president of Hadassah, she had four little girls under the age of 10.
Oh, wow.
There was a way in which, in my mother's family of origin, that was
Hmm.
very problematic because it meant that my grandmother was on the road a lot, she was gone a lot, and it was sort of like, really, you chose Hadassah over us? So from 1928 to 1930, when my mother was from 8 to 10 and her sisters were, on either side of that, they didn't have much access to their mother. And I think they always felt a little like she chose Hadassah over them.
Mm.
And it made them, quite frankly, a bit hostile to Hadassah. And that doesn't mean that they were hostile to Henrietta, but in the conflation in the United States of sort of Henrietta's what she's mainly known for is being the founder of Hadassah. I grew up with my internalizing my mother's resistance to this without ever really examining it. I mean, I didn't really think, why does my mother feel this way? I mean, it didn't really
Hmm.
occur to me. But many, many, many people who are among the funders of the film grew up with mothers who themselves were very active in Hadassah. But because my mother's family connection was started a generation earlier with her mother, I didn't have that. And
Hmm.
so it was a very mixed story about Henrietta. And my mother and her sisters felt that Henrietta did not much care about them because she was really there to see my grandparents, former president of Hadassah, and my grandfather, who was an active Zionist. And she just wanted to talk, Palestinian issues with them at the time. And she was like, these four girls, why are they even at the table? Was kind of how the sisters felt. So all I would say is that I did not grow up with great positive associations with Henrietta. And I knew going into this project that I would come up with my own view of her. That whatever I
Hmm.
got from my mother was so infused with her feeling a bit abandoned by her mother that it wasn't accurate. And so
Yeah.
I went into this project knowing that Henrietta was a force to contend with, had a story that had been told in books but never on film, that had made a huge difference in Palestine and then ultimately the Israeli medical system. And Hadassah was something that I needed to get to know better because I didn't grow up with much access or understanding of it. So, in that way, I'm a little bit of an outlier in my own generation because Jewish women of my age often had mothers who were very active in Hadassah, and I didn't. And so I come from this important legacy, and I felt like I needed to close the gap
Hmm.
um, in a certain way. And I feel like the film does that for me. And I feel very grateful, for having kind of done my own exploration of this and come up with my own ways of being inspired by Henrietta and moved by everything she did and impressed by the legacy that she created, etc. It was, I mean, the other thing you get is how hard it was for a woman in that time period. Again, we're talking, the 1890s to 1940 to be able to make a difference. I mean, Henrietta was uniquely important in some ways in the larger history of women. Forget Jewish women, just
Hmm.
women who made a difference. Um, so I just came away really inspired, respecting what she had done, and really glad I went on this journey to learn more about her. Because growing up how I grew up, I wouldn't necessarily have gotten the. I didn't. It was not transmitted to me in my mother's milk. Let me just say that.
For sure. And I can say, as a filmmaker myself, that I think the most powerful documentaries are the ones where you can tell that the filmmaker is learning as they're going through the journey of making the film. And that comes across in your film with how much information and how knowledge rich it is. It really comes through that you're also gaining something over the course of your journey. And I think for that reason, inserting yourself into the film, I know that that was something that you had some hesitation around. I think it was the right choice, and I think it comes across really beautifully.
Thank you. Let
Um,
me say thank you for that, and credit to my director of photography, Avi Ginzberg in Israel, who just said, "Abby, I'm just going to ignore you telling me not to turn off the camera. I'm going to film this, and you're going to be happy later." And of course, I was.
yeah, honestly, that's I always say it takes a family to make a movie, and
It definitely
sometimes,
took
right?
her.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and exactly right. And family sometimes, tells you the things that you don't want to hear, and it's for your own good. And so I'm
yeah.
glad that you listened to him and you let him do what he wanted in
It
this
was a
case, because
she. It was another.
it
It
was a
was.
she. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
I'm the director, Abby, and my real name is Abigail, and she's
Hmm.
Abigail. Abigail.
I see, I see, I
So it was
see.
the two of us. It was like, who's talking to who? Yeah,
Okay,
but
honestly,
she was
my
directing.
apologies. My apologies for that. Abigail, if you're listening, slicha. But yeah, okay. So I actually wanted to ask a little bit about the filmmaking process because we see you in the archives a lot. Um, we see you interviewing and talking to a lot of different, you know, academics and people that have a lot of knowledge. What was that process like for you? Was it mostly sitting over a whole bunch of old papers and documents? Was it more talking to people and them sending you down the path in the archives? Like, how did that process of the research work?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of simultaneously. Okay, so the women that I interviewed to be let's talk about the women first, and we can talk about the men. So
Sure.
I had Joyce Antler, Shulamit Reinhardt, Shuli Rubin Schwartz, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I don't know. There was probably somebody else, but so my female, scholars
Mm-hmm.
had written things. So I had read what they had written about Henrietta, and those interviews were sort of separate from the archival research I was doing. They had the big picture view of why Henrietta was important. They knew a lot about her work in the early years in Palestine. They understood, the influence of the settlement movement, as we say in the film, and the role of nursing in making healthcare accessible, et cetera. So they were very important to me in terms of sort of setting the scene that Henrietta walked into, and then what she brought from the United States to Palestine, what she was influenced by in the United States, et cetera. So they were my big picture framers, I would say, in a way. Then we have my two male scholars, Zachary Lockman and Usama Makdizi, who really had more to say about the kind of the role of Arabs in
Hmm.
pre-state Palestine, pre-state Israel, Palestine at the time, and I needed them for their information, but none of that really related to the archival research, which each archive had different things in it and was very interesting on their own. So the first archive I went to was the New York Center for Jewish History archive, where Hadassah has all their papers. So there were huge numbers of photographs, which I was able to use, and documents. I mean, I don't know how many boxes there were, maybe 150 boxes. So I could only make my way through so many of them. And I went through them somewhat randomly. I mean, I didn't, I'd say, can I have box 136? And I wouldn't know what was in there. One of the things that's not in the film that is in the boxes in the United States that is so interesting are Henrietta's lists of the number of kids waiting for visas
Oh wow,
from different countries. So you see
wow.
Belgium and you see France and you see Romania and you see Poland and whatever. And she was, I mean, Germany was ready to ship the Jewish kids out. So it was much easier to bring kids from Germany than from
Hmm.
some of these other countries. And she was dealing with the Brits who were either giving her or not giving her the visas. So when you begin to get that there are not only is she moving thousands over to Palestine, but there are thousands that she can't move, and the scope of it, and her begging Hadassah for more money to be able to pay for the visas, et cetera, you really get that she is, the focal point of an incredibly complicated expedition, whatever you want to call it, effort to keep track of who the kids are, where they're coming from, how we're going to get their visas, where they're going to move them to in Palestine. And she was literally coordinating all of that pretty much by herself, because Hans Beit was helping her with the money and so on, but he wasn't figuring out how many, people from France could come at this boat time, at this boat, blah,
Hmm.
blah, blah. That was her. So I just was like, whoa, this is really impressive. So that was what I learned. And you see the founding of Hadassah and a million pictures about early meetings and so on. One of the things that I was surprised by, not just in the archives, but in general, was how well documented, even though it was without sound, her life was. The fact that we see her welcoming a boat, of kids coming from Germany, it's like, who had the vision to think about trying to film that on a 16 millimeter or an 8 millimeter camera? So kudos to people who were paying attention to the important work she was doing at the time, because that gave me the photos and a little bit of the footage that I had to work with. There was literally the only piece of archival footage with her voice in it was the thing that I play in the film, where she's
Mm.
talking about what she's accomplished with Youth Aliyah. That's sort of amazing to me that that's the only piece with her voice, and so at least we hear that she sounds like Eleanor Roosevelt. She had kind of a slightly upper class accent,
Hmm.
even though she herself was absolutely not upper class. So that was interesting. And okay, so and then there were the archives in Israel. So what's in Israel, in the Central Zionist Archive, and that's what you see me going through, those written books with all the Hebrew. Those are the scrapbooks and the gifts that the kids who came gave her at the end of their
Mm.
2 year stay at the kibbutzim, thanking her for bringing them there, telling her all the activities that they've engaged in, with photos of those activities. And so that was like amazing, because there were probably, I don't know, 50, 75 huge scrapbooks. So I'm like, wow, who arranged for that to happen? But they were obviously very meaningful to her. They stayed in Israel and they are now part of the Central Zionist Archive. Um, then there was just one box at the Schlesinger Library, which was interesting. And that was where I found that compromise document. And that became a big archival moment for me, because that document had not been mentioned in any of the books. Nobody had seen it before. And because I found it in her files, I started by assuming she had written it. And I woke up one day, literally, as I'm making the film, thinking, suppose she didn't write that. I don't want to give her credit for writing something that wasn't her work product. And I called them. I called the Schlesinger and I said, could you do me a favor and try to track the origin of this document? Because I plan to use this in my film and I don't want to incorrectly give Henrietta credit for writing.
Hmm.
That's the thing about if the Palestinians and the Jews don't get over their maximalist positions, the future holds nothing but warfare
Yeah.
and disaster. And they came back to me and they said, we don't think she wrote it. We think it actually might have been written by Judah Magnus, but it was definitely written by somebody in the Yehud party. And don't give her credit because that would probably be a historical mistake. And I was like, woo, so glad I thought to ask you because that was a mistake I could have made so easily. I mean, I'm not an archivist. I wasn't looking for, the origin of anything. I just sort of assumed it was in her file. She probably wrote it.
Yeah.
I escaped that mistake, thank God. Um, so it was the archives were rich, but they don't tell the story. I had to put the story together using the archival references that I found and figuring out, kind of the order of the story and when I was going to talk about healthcare, when I was going to talk about youth aliyah. I mean, all that was just challenging from the beginning until we finally finished the film.
For sure. Okay, we have only time for a couple more questions here. So the first question I wanted to ask was one thing that the film that I didn't get from the film at least was, do you know why she chose the name Hadassah for so much of her movement?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, I know it only because everybody's asked it and I didn't know it going into it. Hadassah is the Hebrew name for Esther.
Hmm.
And Hadassah, the organization, was founded around Purim. And
Okay.
so it was to basically honor the work of Esther as, for her good works and for saving the Jewish people from Nebuchadnezzar or whoever she saved them. That's not his name. Ahasuerus. I don't know. So but it is related to the Hebrew name for Esther. That's how that name came to be.
So the movement really, from its inception, was about the strongest Jewish women that we can find.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
And that was the
I love
idea.
that.
Yeah.
I love
And,
that.
and I think one thing that the film stresses, and that again, I sort of, found out while I was doing the work, is that Henrietta's efforts to keep Hadassah a female only, a women only organization was hugely relevant to its long term success. I mean, where we say, the American Zionist organization would have been happy to swallow it up, and Henrietta said no. That was critical to the fact that
Hmm.
it's still here today and thriving. So, again, credit to Henrietta. There were a lot of things she was very smart about that others might have missed.
I think the film definitely gets that point across of how much foresight she had, particularly in regards to the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what she saw pre-State of Israel between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine. So, on that note, is there anything that you want to make sure that our audience takes away if people walk away from this movie talking about just one aspect of Henrietta's legacy? What would be the important? I know it's hard to limit that, but like, what
Uh,
to you stands out as the
so
most
I'm going
important
to talk
takeaway?
about what I take away from her story
Please, sure, okay.
because I mean, I'm going to, it's like uh, what I am inspired by, is how hard she worked in the face of unbelievable obstacles. I mean, I get exhausted, for any number of different reasons. And then I think about what Henrietta was doing with no cell phone, with no fax machines, with no nothing, other than her typewriter, her pen, and her ability to stick a letter into an envelope and send it 3 weeks away to the United States. So when I think about what Henrietta was able to accomplish and her dogged commitment, to the things that really mattered to her, to making sure that healthcare really served everybody, that there was well baby care in Israel, Palestine, then Israel, to making sure that as many kids survived and thrived because she was really concerned with them thriving as
Mhm.
well as just surviving. I'm like, okay, get over yourself. What do you have to complain about? And she did this in the middle of a world war. So I feel like what the takeaway I want people to have about it is, to not either be discouraged by obstacles that are in our way when we're trying to do something. I mean, let's take the major premise is she was engaged at a level of tikkun olam that the rest of us can only aspire to.
Mhm.
And she embraced it, kept at it until the day she died. And so I think that's kind of the meta message for me from the film is it's like let Henrietta stay on your shoulder and push you forward a little bit more to do more than you think you can do because the world is in such desperate need of help. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it in your community by, reading to children at the public library or doing it by raising money for Hadassah Hospital or doing something else in your community. It doesn't matter what it is. But I am hoping that people will take away her dogged persistence and her ability to not get overwhelmed by fatigue and upset and so on because things weren't working out the way she thought they should, and to just keep putting one foot in front of the other until our feet stop working. And I say that as a 70, almost 76-year-old today. So it's like I'm looking at, the light shining at the end of the tunnel. And I'm like, okay, but this is a really important life lesson for me, I think. And that's part of the reason I'm so glad I made the film is that, I feel kicked in the butt by Henrietta literally every day by one reason, for one reason or another. And the last thing I would say about what I hope people take away from the film, and it's less about what they take away from the film and more what I'm trying to do with the film, is I think this is a really important film for young people of any background. You don't have to be Jewish to love Henrietta. And so, what I'm doing, and I want people to know this, is I am shortening the film, creating a teacher guide to go with it, and trying to get it into high schools and colleges so that Henrietta can inspire more people who've never heard of her. I mean, that was sort of the goal in making the film. And now I realize that that's fine. I made a 79-minute film, but for academic settings, it's got to be shorter. And so I am working on that now.
Okay, beautiful. Honestly, I think that's a message we could all take something away from, no matter our age. I think putting our feet one in front of the other and having the persistence that Henrietta showed is something that, like you said, we can all aspire to. So yeah, I want to say thanks again for making a
Thank
really
you.
wonderful film,
Thank you.
and yeah, and I hope we get as many eyes on it as we can, and hopefully you have a lot of success and good luck with getting it into some academic settings because there's a lot to learn from Henrietta.
And just one last thing, please,
Sure.
anybody watching this, tell your friends that it will be at the Toronto Jewish Film Festival on June 11th at 5:30. So if you know anybody in Toronto, please tell them to come out for the film. And thanks to everybody in Edmonton who did come out to the film.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, once again, thanks, Abby. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck in the future. And hopefully, we see you again with another Jewish project one day.
I hope so. Thank you so
Okay,
much. Take care.
great.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.